She was delivered like a debt. He gave her back her name. Now the man who broke her is coming with the sheriff. The scent of dry dust and old pine clung to the single room of Elias's cabin, a space he had built with his own hands years ago. His bed, a simple frame with a mattress stuffed with corn husks, was made with a neatness that spoke of solitude. By the low light of a single lamp, he mended a leather harness, his large, calloused hands working the needle and awl with a practiced, gentle precision. Outside, the vast, sun-scorched plains of the territory stretched into an endless quiet, a silence he had long mistaken for peace. He was a man accustomed to the weight of his own company, his thoughts as spare and steady as his movements. His life was a rhythm of chores, mending fences, tending his small herd of cattle, drawing water from the well. Love, to him, was not a word spoken, but a duty performed, the protection of his land, the care of his animals. He sought belonging in the solid earth beneath his feet, in the familiar heft of his rifle, in the unwavering certainty of the rising sun. He did not know he was lonely until he heard the sound of approaching horses breaking the evening stillness, a sound that carried the sharp, unwelcome tang of trouble. The trouble arrived in the form of two grim-faced men, Caleb and John, and the sister who stood between them like a ghost. They dismounted without a word, their movements stiff with shame and anger. Elias rose slowly, placing the harness aside, his hand resting near the warm grip of the pistol at his hip. He knew the brothers. They ran a scrabble-bit ranch a half-day's ride away, known more for their sour dealings than their cattle. It was the woman he did not know. Her head was bowed, a tangle of dark hair obscuring her face, but her stillness was a thing of pride, not submission. She did not flinch when Caleb shoved her forward. "She's yours, Blackwood," Caleb bit out, the words tasting like poison. "We'll not have her under our roof, not after—" He didn't finish, his gaze flicking to the dark bruise that marred her temple. The story was there in the silence, in the brothers' rigid disgust and the woman's defiant quiet. She was ruined in their eyes, and they were here to discard her. Elias's gaze moved from the brothers' cruel faces to the woman. He saw the slight tremble in her hands, clenched into fists at her sides. He saw the resilience in the set of her shoulders, a strength they were too blind to recognize. He looked at her, truly looked, and saw not shame, but a survivor. "Her name is Elara," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a question. John grunted, surprised Elias knew. Elias had heard whispers, of course, of the woman who had fought back against a wealthy landowner's advances. "She has a name," Elias repeated, his quiet tone a rebuke. He stepped forward, his body deliberately shielding her from her brother's view. "Leave her be, and get off my land." The brothers, eager to be rid of their burden, mounted and fled into the twilight, leaving Elara standing in the dust of their departure. She did not watch them go. She finally lifted her head, and her eyes, perceptive and shadowed with pain, met his. In that moment, the quiet of his life was broken, replaced by the thrum of a shared, uncertain heartbeat. The first days were a study in silence. Elara moved through his small cabin with a contained grace, a woman mapping the edges of a new, fragile safety. She claimed a small cot in the corner, her few belongings tucked neatly beside it. Elias gave her space, his movements deliberate and slow, a silent promise not to crowd her. The air between them was thick with things unsaid, with the history that had brought her to his door. He learned her rhythms not through words, but through observation. She rose with the first light, her presence a soft stirring in the quiet of the dawn. He would find the water bucket already filled, his breakfast of oats laid out on the small table. They did not speak of it. It was a trade, an offering. He provided the roof and the protection of his name. She provided a touch of care to the stark solitude of his home. The first time he saw her truly work, he felt a shift in the foundations of his world. She was in the small garden patch he'd long neglected, her hands, surprisingly strong, pulling weeds with a fierce determination. The sun beat down, and he brought her a dipper of cool water from the well. She took it without looking up, but her fingers brushed his, a touch as light as a moth's wing, yet it sent a jolt through him. He found himself watching her, the way she mended his worn shirt with tiny, perfect stitches, the way her brow furrowed in concentration as she ground coffee beans. These were small, domestic acts, yet they felt like acts of profound bravery. She was reclaiming herself, one quiet task at a time. One evening, he returned from the fields to find the cabin filled with the scent of baking bread. A loaf, golden and warm, sat cooling on the table. It was more than food. It was a statement. I am still here. I can still create. That night, they ate in their usual silence, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the tentative, humming silence of two people beginning to learn the language of each other's presence. He started leaving a small wildflower on the table for her each morning, a splash of purple or yellow against the rough-hewn wood. He never mentioned it, and she never acknowledged it, but he would see her tuck it into the small jar of water she kept by her cot. The gesture was a quiet conversation, a daily affirmation. He began to see the world through a different lens, noticing things he had previously overlooked. The way the late afternoon sun caught the dust motes dancing in the air, the soft hoot of an owl in the pre-dawn stillness, the subtle shift in the wind that heralded rain. His life had been a series of duties, but now it felt like a series of shared moments. The thin walls of the cabin became a conduit for a new kind of intimacy. He could hear the soft sigh of her breath as she slept, a sound that soothed the loneliness in him he hadn't known he carried. She, in turn, learned the sound of his footsteps, the heavy, steady tread that meant he was near, that she was safe. A longing began to grow in him, a quiet, aching thing that settled deep in his chest. It was a yearning for more than just her presence, but for the unguarded smile he had yet to see, for the sound of her name spoken in something other than the harsh tones of her past. One sweltering afternoon, a sudden summer storm broke, the rain coming down in hard, driving sheets. They were caught inside together, the world outside a blur of gray. The roof sprang a leak, a steady drip, drip, drip near her cot. Without a word, he moved her small bed to the drier side of the room, near his own. He then climbed onto a chair to patch the leak, his back to her. He could feel her watching him, her gaze a tangible weight. When he was done, he turned to find her holding out a clean, dry cloth for him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so soft he barely caught it. It was the first time she had spoken to him directly about an act of care. He simply nodded, his throat tight. The air in the small cabin felt charged, the sound of the rain and their quiet breathing the only things in the world. The heat of summer settled deep into the bones of the land, making the small cabin a crucible. Days were spent in the shade of the porch, mending tack or shelling beans, the air thick and still. They moved around each other with a practiced awareness, a choreography of shared space that had become as natural as breathing. The silence was no longer a barrier, but a shared language. He learned the subtle shift in her posture that meant she was tired, the slight furrow of her brow that spoke of a painful memory. She learned the tension in his shoulders that meant he was worried about the cattle, the rare, almost imperceptible softening of his jaw when he looked at the sunset. One evening, the air was too hot to bear. Elias took 2 tin mugs and filled them with cool water from the well, carrying them out to the porch where Elara sat, watching the stars begin to prick the deep indigo sky. He handed one to her, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. He sat on the top step, a respectable distance away, yet he had never felt closer to another soul. "The stars are bright tonight," she said, her voice a low murmur. "They are," he agreed. He wanted to say more, to tell her how her presence had filled the empty spaces of his life, how he had come to depend on the quiet strength he saw in her. But the words were foreign to him, clumsy things. Instead, he simply stayed, sharing the quiet of the night with her. After a long moment, she shifted, her knee brushing against his. Neither of them moved away. It was a small, simple touch, yet it was a profound choice. In the vast, lonely expanse of the frontier, under the silent watch of a million stars, they had chosen this closeness. It was a silent vow, a recognition of the bond that had grown between them in the heat and the hush of their shared lives. Their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a buggy, kicking up a cloud of officious dust. In it sat Mr. Abernathy, the wealthy landowner whose advances Elara had spurned, the cause of her brother's shame. He was a man whose entitlement was as plain as the expensive waistcoat he wore, a stark contrast to the rustic simplicity of Elias's ranch. He did not wait for an invitation, stepping down from his buggy with a proprietary air, his eyes immediately finding Elara, who had stilled at the sound of his arrival. Elias moved to stand slightly in front of her, a silent shield. "Blackwood," Abernathy said, his tone condescending. "I've come for what is mine." His gaze slid past Elias to Elara, a possessive, predatory gleam in his eyes. "The girl's family and I have come to an understanding. A debt has been paid. She is to be my wife." Elara flinched, a barely perceptible movement, but Elias felt it as if it were his own. The lie was brazen, a clear attempt to use his power and her family's cowardice to claim her. "She is under my protection," Elias stated, his voice dangerously low. "Her brothers left her here." Abernathy laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "They left her because she was disgraced. I am being generous, offering to restore her honor." He took a step forward, his hand outstretched towards Elara. "Come, Elara, there is no need for this frontier foolishness. You will have a fine house, fine clothes." His words were a poison, meant to remind her of her vulnerability, of the social ruin she faced. Elias saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, but also a spark of defiance. She did not move. "This is my home now," she said, her voice trembling but clear. The words struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. My home. She had claimed this place, and in doing so had claimed him. Abernathy's face hardened. "We shall see about that, Blackwood. The law is on the side of respectable men." He turned and climbed back into his buggy, his final look a promise of future trouble. The dust settled, leaving behind a new, palpable tension. The outside world, with its cruel judgments and entitled predators, had found them. The threat of Abernathy lingered like a sickness in the air. Elias took to sleeping on a pallet by the door, his rifle within easy reach. He was scanning for threats again, but this time it was not for his land or his cattle, but for her. He watched the horizon, his jaw set in a hard line. Elara, in turn, became even more quiet, her resilience tested. He saw the shadows under her eyes, the way she started at any unexpected sound. The social pressure was a cage Abernathy was building around them. Whispers started in the small, nearby town. People Elias had known for years now looked at him with suspicion, their wives pulling their skirts aside as Elara passed. They were an outcast and a woman he was sheltering, a pariah. One afternoon, Abernathy returned, not alone this time, but with the town's sheriff, a man whose loyalty was easily bought. "Blackwood," the sheriff said, avoiding Elias's gaze, "Mr. Abernathy has filed a complaint. He claims you're holding this woman against her will, that her family entrusted her to his care." It was a gross twisting of the truth, but one that carried the weight of Abernathy's influence. "She is here by choice," Elias said, his voice a low growl. The sheriff looked at Elara. "Ma'am, is that true? Are you free to leave?" The question hung in the air, a test of her courage. Her entire future rested on her answer. To side with Elias meant further disgrace in the eyes of the world. To go with Abernathy meant a life of gilded servitude. She looked not at the sheriff, but at Elias, her gaze steady and unwavering. She saw the fierce protectiveness in his eyes, the quiet promise of safety. She took a step forward, her hand finding his, her fingers lacing with his in a gesture that was both a comfort and a declaration. "I am where I belong," she said, her voice clear and strong. Abernathy's face contorted in a mask of fury. "She's lying. The woman is a harlot and a liar." He lunged for her, his entitlement finally breaking through his veneer of civility. In a flash, Elias moved between them, his hand seizing Abernathy's wrist in a grip of iron. "You will not touch her," he snarled, his voice a promise of violence. The predator had shown his true face, and the protector had met the challenge. A confrontation on the porch was a moment frozen in time. Elias's grip on Abernathy's wrist was unyielding, his eyes burning with a cold fire. The sheriff, startled by the raw display of protective fury, took a half-step back. "That's enough, Blackwood," he stammered, but his words lacked conviction. Elara, standing just behind Elias, her hand still holding his, was his anchor. Her touch was a silent testament to their united front. "She said she is where she belongs," Elias said, his voice low and carrying the weight of an oath. "This is my land. And she is my ... double quotes." He paused, the word catching in his throat. He had no official claim to her, no piece of paper that would satisfy the likes of Abernathy or the sheriff. He had only the truth of what had grown between them in the quiet rooms of his home. He looked at Elara, a question in his eyes. She met his gaze, her expression clear and resolute. She squeezed his hand, a silent permission, a shared choice. He turned back to Abernathy and the sheriff, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "She is my wife." The words, spoken into the tense silence, were a vow, a shield, a final, irrevocable choice. Abernathy paled, sputtering in disbelief. The sheriff, seeing the unshakable resolve in both Elias and Elara, and perhaps a flicker of his own conscience, finally asserted himself. "You heard the woman, Abernathy. And you heard him. There's no crime here. It's time for you to leave." Defeated and humiliated, Abernathy wrenched his arm from Elias's grasp and stormed back to his buggy, his threats dissolving into the dust. As the buggy disappeared down the long track, Elias and Elara stood together, their hands still clasped, the world shrinking until it was only the two of them on the porch of the home they had just claimed, together. The dust settled, and a profound quiet fell, deeper than any they had known before. The adrenaline of the confrontation drained away, leaving them both trembling slightly. Elias turned to Elara, his eyes searching hers, filled with a raw vulnerability. He had claimed her as his wife, a public declaration that had been both a strategy and a heartfelt truth. Now, in the aftermath, he needed to know it was a truth she chose as well. He gently released her hand and cupped her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. His touch was careful, reverent. "Elara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I spoke the truth. In my heart." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a brief moment. "I know," she whispered. The trust in her voice was absolute. He led her inside, away from the harsh light of the afternoon sun and the prying eyes of the world. He sat her down at the small table and knelt before her, taking her hands in his. He examined them, noting a small scrape on her knuckle she must have gotten in the garden. Without a word, he went to the small cupboard where he kept his medical supplies, retrieving a clean cloth and a tin of salve. He carefully cleaned the scrape and applied the soothing balm, his touch gentle and focused. It was a small act of aftercare, a return to the quiet language of devotion they understood best. He was not just her protector from the outside world. He was the keeper of her small hurts, the mender of her everyday wounds. When he was done, he did not let go of her hand. He simply held it, his head bowed, the pulse in her wrist a steady, reassuring beat against his fingertips. In the quiet of the cabin, with the threat vanquished, they found their peace not in victory, but in the tender, silent reaffirmation of their bond. In the days that followed, a new rhythm established itself, one born of a shared future, not just a shared space. The declaration on the porch had changed everything. It had transformed the cabin from a temporary shelter into a permanent home. The line between his and hers blurred, and then disappeared entirely. Her few belongings moved from the cot to the shelves beside his bed. His routine, once solitary, now included her at every turn. They moved together in the small space with an easy, practiced grace. One morning, he found her holding his rifle, not with fear, but with a quiet curiosity. He came up behind her and gently guided her hands, showing her how to hold it, how to check the chamber, how to feel its weight and balance. He then took it from her and returned it to its rack, hilt first, a gesture of absolute trust. That evening, as lamplight filled the cabin with a warm golden glow, she spoke his name, Elias, so softly it was almost a sigh. It was the first time she had done so, with such unguarded tenderness. He looked up from the boot he was mending, and for the first time she gave him a true, unguarded smile. It was a small, radiant thing that transformed her face and sent a wave of warmth through his entire being. He confessed then, in the intimate circle of the lamplight, the depth of his feelings. The words were simple, unadorned, but they carried the weight of all the silent days and watchful nights. "I think," he said, his voice raspy, "I was waiting for you, Elara, even before I knew you." She didn't answer with words. She simply reached across the table and laid her hand on his, a silent vow that answered his own. Their life together settled into a quiet devotion. He gave her a small, hand-carved bird, its wings outstretched, a token of the freedom she had found with him. She, in turn, repaired the worn leather cover of his favorite book, her stitches a testament to her care. These small gifts and repairs were their love letters, tangible symbols of their commitment. The forced proximity of their beginning had blossomed into a chosen intimacy. He would come in from the fields, and she would be there, a calm and steady presence that had become the anchor of his world. They learned to read each other's moods in the slightest of gestures, the set of a jaw, the touch of a hand on a shoulder. Their love was not in grand declarations, but in the small, repeated acts of daily life. It was in the way he always made sure the woodbox was full, so she would never be cold. It was in the way she saved him the last of the coffee, just the way he liked it. Their vows were not spoken in a church, but in the plain speech of their everyday lives. "I'll keep you warm," he'd murmur, pulling the blanket higher over her shoulders at night. "I am home," she'd whisper, her hand finding his in the dark. They had been two lonely souls, a protector and a survivor, brought together by circumstance. But in the quiet sanctuary of the home they had built, they had become something more. They were partners, a family, their future stretching before them, as vast and as promising as the frontier sky. Their love story was written not in ink, but in the shared warmth of a hearth, the steady rhythm of two hearts beating as one. The heat of late summer finally broke, giving way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The cottonwood trees along the creek turned a brilliant yellow, and the air held a new, clean scent of damp earth and coming change. Elias and Elara stood on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and violet. He had spent the day winterizing the cabin, sealing the cracks with mud and straw, while she had been preserving the last of the garden's bounty. The work was hard, but it was shared work, the labor of building a life together. He slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, a perfect fit. They stood like that for a long time, in a comfortable, easy silence, watching the stars emerge one by one. There was no longer any yearning, no uncertainty. The guarded solitude had been replaced by a deep and abiding devotion. The loneliness had been banished by the simple, profound act of choosing each other, day after day. "I never thought," she began, her voice soft in the twilight, "that I would find a place where I could just be." He tightened his hold on her, pressing a kiss to her hair. "This is your place, Elara," he said, his voice a low, steady promise against her ear. Always? It was a vow made not in the heat of a climax or the face of a threat, but here, in the quiet of an ordinary evening. It was a promise of a future, sealed not with spectacle, but with the steady, quiet rhythm of a shared life, a shared home, and a love that had found its voice in the silence.